Excellent.
Hey, Lance.
Hey, Bret. How's it
How
going?
you doing, man? It's going great.
Yeah. Can't complain, man.
It is a strange spring moment
Yeah.
in Texas. It's like in the 50s and 60s, and it's raining, and it's really nice, especially considering we're going to be, it's like a sandwich with, you know, we came out of the hundreds and we're going back into the hundreds pretty quickly. So these last few days are nice.
We sent some of our weather down your way, I guess.
Yeah.
Here in the Pacific Northwest, we haven't had a day over 80 degrees this year. So
Oh,
still waiting.
yeah.
I think we'll be waiting for a while, too.
Good. Well, we're going to need that help because it looks like it's going to be a hot summer. And since this is the year 2050, when you're actually seeing this, right. When I say hot, I mean, it's going to be like 186 degrees.
Forget frying eggs. We're frying chickens.
On the sidewalks.
That's right.
Anyway, so we had a conversation last week about employee experience, and the Starr conspiracy has a very specific view of employee experience. We have a clear definition, a strategic framework. We break employee experience down into 5 subdomains. We believe it's important to take a holistic view of those subdomains. Those subdomains are the employer brand, recruitment marketing, candidate experience, work experience, and employee success. You know, a lot to be discussed around each of those subdomains, but we got stuck in employer brand last week. I thought we were going to, you know, probably talk about all 5 subdomains, but employer brand is so interesting. There's so much stuff to talk about.
So much stuff.
Yeah, that we, you know, just used all of our time talking about that. And we decided to talk more about it today.
Yeah, exactly.
So in future episodes, we will talk about recruitment marketing and candidate experience and work experience and employee success and how those all add up to a holistic view of employee experience. But employer brand, I think, is where a lot of people start when they get serious. You know, when they get serious about the employee experience, a lot of times their first thought is of their employer brand. And that's when they've moved beyond, you know, the kind of myopic belief that there's 1 or 2 things they can do in some aspect of the employee experience that's going to have a dramatic impact. When in reality, we need to create defining moments in all of those subdomains in order to, you know, create a great employee experience. But with employee experience specifically, you know, there's a pattern around, or employer brand specifically, there's a pattern around how people engage with internal teams or with external agencies like ours to figure out what employer brand is, what it is for that company, and, you know, how to leverage it to achieve the goals of the organization.
Yeah.
And why don't you talk a little bit about, in your experience, what you've seen as, you know, the initial milestones? It seems like everybody in my experience, you know, kind of approaches it the same way. But you know, in terms of specifically, I'm talking about when a company gets together with an agency to work on their employer brand, which is a very similar model, you know, when folks engage with their internal teams, because there is kind of a conventional process out there. What do those first steps of that process look like?
What should they look like? What are they today?
What are they today? Because we have a very strong opinion about what they should look like. Yeah.
Today it's, you know, today it's a pretty limited process. So, you know, you're looking pretty closely, you know, you're looking at primarily a careers page as a starting point for where that message sort of gets lined up. You're looking at alignment with kind of a master brand for the organization. I know we've got some opinions on what that involves, but you know, looking for some alignment there. Usually, like obviously from a creative and visual perspective, like staying on brand there, but also from a messaging perspective, like trying to carry through some of that work there. You might have, you know, what I see really popular, you know, for companies that are really trying to approach this as well as they can. I mean, I think is, you know, doing like interviews with folks. A lot of times, like doing like case study style interviews with folks rather than just like sort of like, I think a few years ago, well, I'd say a few years ago, maybe a couple decades ago, you just saw lots of like B-roll footage of like happy employees as sort of like the video element that you might include there. And you just have a lot more folks kind of giving more just like a candid, maybe more quote unquote candid views of just like what's like to work here, the things that they're sort of attached to there. And that's it. So, I mean, like, I think a lot of folks really focus heavily on like sort of getting the career site updated. I've talked to just a number of TA leaders who like, this is like their initiative for the year is like to really put a fresh face on everything they're doing from sort of the external perspective. And it's all sort of hubbed and spoked from the career site as sort of the hub. Which I think that, that can make some sense, but I think it's all based on that, so I think everything else is, there's some light messaging sometimes, there's kind of what we call in marketing, like features, benefits, updates, make sure everything's, are we talking about all the benefits that we are, or is it updated for like our sort of like a, if you've added hybrid or if you've added remote work, or are you talking about how that's changed? Are you talking to people who are, not just sitting in an office getting interviewed, but maybe sitting in their home offices, working, those sorts of things. So those are some of the things I've heard about. And that's sort of the typical process. It's not necessarily super regimented. It's a lot of sort of like, let's draft off the corporate brand from a visuals perspective. Let's try to tell some stories. Let's sort of maybe try to develop a EVP, which, employer value proposition, which, I don't think has a lot of, research behind it necessarily. It's a lot of like, sort of like meeting brainstorming with TA leaders and maybe some hiring leaders to sort of figure that part out, and then update that stuff on your public facing sites and, call it a day. That's it, right?
Yeah. So obviously, I think you described a traditional, kind of process that most people go through, most organizations go through when they're contemplating employer brand. I really want to break this down to like a 101 level and go through some of these assumptions. But there's a couple of things that you brought up that I want to ask you questions about. And the first is that pretty much everything that you said sounds like marketing to me. It's a form of marketing. And, employer branding, which is different than your employer brand, because employer branding is the act of trying to establish that brand in terms of recognition and reach and, all that stuff. Is it possible to think about your employer brand separate from marketing? How much coordination with marketing is necessary? How much coordination with, the overriding brand and message that is CX or customer facing is really necessary?
Yeah, I think if you have an internal team working on it, you don't, outside of really the largest companies, you just don't have dedicated resources inside of your employer brand function to accomplish any of this work. So you are depending really heavily on your internal marketing team, or you're looking at contractors or agencies or those sorts of things to sort of bring about a vision. And so I think that's why a lot of times there's not a lot of maybe best practices or a lot of rigor necessarily around this. Just because I think a lot of it's like self-managed, and, HR and recruiting leaders are sort of picking up sort of the, whatever resources they can to get this accomplished. And so you might have a videographer on staff and a producer on staff who can help you with videos, but they're probably tied up on most CX initiatives, right? And they may even be, on other needs that sort of apply there. But yeah, I think that's sort of, I don't know if that actually answers your question, but yeah, I mean, I think that there's shared resources there.
Yeah, it does. But, let's get really precise. Is your employer brand the same as your customer brand?
No.
However, they overlap.
There's some overlap. Yeah.
Yeah. In a Venn diagram, both in terms of, messaging, and assets like visual look and feel, and stuff like that, but also resources used to execute. And so employer brand is not the same as customer brand. But in that context, unfortunately, since it utilizes many of the same resources, it becomes really low priority compared to the customer brand.
Yeah.
And, execution, which is often, as important, if not more important than the thoughtful process of discovering what your employer brand actually is, often suffers because of lack of funding, lack of internal resources, lack of budget to go out and work with a partner who really understands the nuances of employer branding, which is similar to lack of funding, but a very specific use case. So,
yeah,
basically employer brand, kind of has to drink the same wine, but not from the same cup as a customer brand. And then the question is, okay, if you really want to get serious about employer brand as additive to your employee experience, then what should the process really look like? And, I think that, in my opinion, the conventional processes that are considered the most sophisticated in the market are severely lacking, right?
Yeah.
And so my experience is, when you get beyond the level of, hey, our employer brand is expressed through our career website and we're going to shoot some videos and stuff like that. When you move beyond that, stage of maturity to the next stage of maturity, it seems to me, and I'd be, really interested to get your perspective on this, but it seems to me that there's a pretty, accepted standard, sophisticated, quote, air quotes, process in the market. And that process generally starts all the proposals that I've seen, all the, RFPs that, I've seen associated with this, et cetera. They all start with an audit of some kind, which is research based. And that's, could be current employees, could be a combination of current employees and ex-employees, could be a combination of people who have gone through the, candidate experience, but, not been hired. But 99.9% of the time, the research is specifically focused on current employees.
Yeah.
And that could be in the form of an engagement survey, or it could be in the form of an audit that's more specific to, employer brand building. But, step one tends to be, hey, we're going to run this research phase or this audit phase inside an organization to get a sense of what your employer brand truly is. And there's a lot of ways that could go wrong, which we can talk about. And then the second step seems to be, okay, we're going to analyze all of this information and we're going to create a message. And that message is, as you mentioned, is often referred to as the employee value proposition. That can be broken down into different components, and different organizations view it in different ways, what those components should be, how to effectively express, an employer brand message. But those seem to be the first steps. Step one is audit / research, and step two is a simple message that becomes the, pillar of, all execution activities down the road. Does that make sense? Is that what you see?
Yeah. I mean, it's what's asked, right? And a lot of times there is some, I've seen a couple who have sort of like, also looked at sort of the competitive landscape as well, to sort of see like, hey, here's what other brands that you're competing for talent look like in the space. And a lot of times, I'll bring up example, for example, like, Nike here in Portland. they've got like competitor because Adidas's U.S. headquarters is based here. So they would look at like, you know, Adidas as well as like Columbia Sportswear is also based here, which isn't necessarily a direct competitor. They're not a footwear competitor necessarily, but they are like a talent competitor.
Yeah.
And then you got like, you know, other companies that people can work for, you know, startups, those sorts of things that all have employer brands as well. So you do see a little bit of like outside competitive research, at least at the most sophisticated level. I don't think that's necessarily the norm. I think what you're talking about is the norm, which is like, hey, let's run a survey of current employees. Let's see sort of what their you know, best cases, you know, attitudes, behaviors, and beliefs about their work experience. Let's capture some of that sentiment in some way, and then let's turn that into work. That's usually the extent of it. Yeah.
Yeah. So first of all, we believe that model is flawed, and you know, we believe in a more, you know, comprehensive strategic framework, and we can talk about that down the road a little bit. But if we, you know, acknowledge, and I think most people listening to this would agree that, you know, the 1-2 punch at the beginning of an employer brand exercise is usually that research phase, and then you know, the generation of a message.
Yeah.
You know, it seems to me that, you know, one of the biggest negative outcomes of the research phase, which is caused, in my opinion, by, you know, kind of the lack of a holistic strategic framework, is what happens in the gap between the interpretation of that information, how the information is collected, what questions are asked, and the gap that occurs in the interpretation of that information and then the creation of the message. And so, to use a real world example, we've been talking about PwC now for a while. And, you know, since we talked about them last, I don't know if you've noticed, but PwC is, you know, on the news circuit. They're, you know, on all the news networks. They're talking about employee experience,
That's right.
talking about their investment, et cetera. And so, you know, they're really putting a lot of resources into promoting, you know, their employer brand based on their investment employee experience. But one of the things that I believe that we recognized in the work that was done, which highlights this, you know, kind of potential, you know, negative outcome of that 1-2 punch, is I think both of us looked at all of the announcements and we saw the common themes that were shared across news releases and press appearances and, you know, all that stuff. And we said, oh, the pillars of this message are really clear. And, you know, one of those pillars that pops to mind is that employees value flexibility, right?
Yeah.
So it was clear that they were hitting on the flexibility, you know, kind of message over and over and over again, which was one of, you know, maybe 3 or 4 that were part of their message platform for that. And so to me, that represents, you know, kind of one of the big risks of the way things are done now, which is I interpreted that as, you know, the research was done. It was done primarily with, you know, employees at the company, and the employees at the company stated what they value most in, you know, their work experience and in their employee experience. And then you know, in the message exercise, the company basically said, we do that. And here's more of us doing that. So there was like this aspirational notion in the data that was collected of, you know, people valuing flexibility with no real context about whether they feel they have that flexibility now or not. And, you know, I can see somebody, you know, looking down at, you know, a spreadsheet or a PowerPoint presentation or presenting in a, you know, a conference room saying the number one thing that PwCers care about is flexibility. So that has to be in our employee value proposition. Yeah. And I think that the strategic interface with how that actually is being executed or needs to be executed in the organization in order to be true is, you know, kind of not there most of the time. And you know, there's no real thought given to, well, yeah, this is an aspirational position. This is what people want, but we don't deliver it right now. And so we better figure out how to deliver it, you know, across multiple, you know, subdomains of the employee experience. Or if we go out to market with a message, that we're all about flexibility, and our current work experience and employee success is not actually like that, that could cause a lot of problems. So it seems to me that there is often, an aspirational strategic leap from the research to the message creation that's not grounded in the reality of the current experience.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Well, it makes a ton of sense, because I think that's where a lot of employer brands get it wrong. They're aspirational. I mean, like what you see on a lot of career sites, and sort of like the primary place where employers are expressing their brand for employees is, you see a lot of the aspiration. You see a lot of the this is where we want to be, but not describing like, hey, we're not there yet. I mean, like here's some of the things you're going to be challenged with when you come here. And so I think there's a huge disconnect when you get to these organizations. You're like, oh, I didn't unless you did like research, a ton of research, maybe talk to interview employees as a candidate, and really got an inside look, or somebody. I think that's sort of the ongoing challenges. Like, I think we talked about in the last episode about trying to appeal to everybody. I think it's also sort of like this very like Pollyanna, like these things are going great now. Yeah, we fixed the issue.
Yeah,
those sorts of things. So I think it's a big challenge. I think it's just sort of something that's glossed over, and is actually like sometimes seen as a positive, that you're not sort of you're sort of whitewashing away a lot of the challenges and the things that make somebody successful at the organization too.
Yeah. So this is a story as old as time, right? Because, the roots of this issue are grounded in CX. They're grounded in customer experience. If your marketing is so far ahead of what your product can actually deliver, you can acquire a lot of new customers for a while. But the result is churn, on the back end, which, SaaS companies care a lot about. All companies care a lot about, but for SaaS companies specifically, churn is a huge, kind of metric that drives valuation and stuff like that. And so on the CX side, it's well understood that, marketing can be aspirational as long as that aspirational frame is communicated and promoted. But it can't be so far out in front of the actual product experience that it ends up creating a gap between expectations and what's actually delivered, because that results in churn. Same thing in employee experience. If your employer brand and your recruitment marketing are way out ahead of what the actual work experience is, which is very similar to the marketing and product connection in CX, it results in churn. What we're seeing right now, I think, is the lack of, a holistic process that starts with strategy and understanding what the strategy is behind employer brand. That lack of strategy manifesting in a short-term goal to create a message that helps with, a inaccurately framed issue that most people are referring to as the Great Resignation.
Right.
And so I think, when people are approaching employer brands right now and recruitment marketing, such as PwC, just as an example that was recently in the press, they're basically responding to the needs of the time. And the needs of the time are, 50% turnover across all industries in 2021. I've only said that about 1 million times. It doesn't look like it's slowing much. People are generally saying, what can we do from an employer brand perspective, a recruitment marketing perspective, and a candidate experience perspective, if they're even thinking about it as being, that distinguished in terms of the different, kind of subcomponents. What can we do with our employer brand that allows us to hire more people so that we can replace the people who are leaving?
Yeah.
And I think too, a couple of things that are wrong with that. Number one is you should never create a durable brand in response to a short-term issue, because your message ends up being very myopically focused on the issue of the day, and can't stand the test of time. And number two, it ignores strategically the underlying issues completely, which is don't resign yourself to expecting 50% turnover. Imagine that you could actually, improve your product,
Imagine a world where that's possible.
I know. Can you imagine like a CEO or a chief revenue officer or whatever saying, well, our product sucks, so let's just market more,
or spend more on marketing. That's the fix.
Yeah, that's the fix. And yet that's exactly what's happening in employee experience is the product sucks for a lot of companies. They know it sucks, to be fair, I don't think they know it sucks. There's this huge gap between what employees want and what companies are willing to give. And I think some are just entrenched and feel that, the expectations of the employees are way out of whack with reality. And, very, very condescending, kind of a position in, the HR space right now from some of the thought leaders in the space, about just constantly harping on the crazy things that Gen Z wants and the crazy expectations of, blah, 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 blah. And, if our response in CX was to malign our customers for being stupid and unreasonable because they don't like our products, that wouldn't fly. And it's not flying in employee experience either. But there you go. People are basically trying to, use employer brand, specifically as a marketing tactic to address, turnover by just, creating more supply of talent. Any of that makes sense? I know that was kind of
it makes a ton of sense. I mean, it made me think of probably one of my, most durable hot takes. And it actually goes back, I say generations now. I've been in the industry for a couple decades. So you have too. We've heard time and time again, one of the ways that organizations get around this is with referrals. And referrals have been such a great source of hire. Jay Crispin and Career Crossroads has been covering this probably even longer than we've both been in the industry. They've done the research to say this is the top source of hire. These people stay longer, they perform better. And a lot of folks kind of badmouth referrals because you get sort of the culture just replication of things, which I get. And so you're thinking, oh, these guys are the people that you're hiring from referrals are just sort of culture clones. You're going to the same alumni networks. You're just getting a bunch of people that look like the people that look like your organization. But I think there's a much more fundamental thing that actually ties back to employer brand is that you see the advertisements, you see sort of what a company's doing in the industry. And I'll use us for example, just because I've referred 3 people to the Starr Conspiracy that we've hired. I don't think I've referred very many other people. I've talked to lots of people about the Starr Conspiracy, but they know us from our work. They see some of our employees out there, and they're like, I wonder what it's like to work there. So they talk to me for half an hour. They talk to me for an hour. They might buy me a beer. They get the real unvarnished truth. And the people that come in and are hired have a totally different level of context than somebody who's just been through sort of a marketing funnel of the typical employer brand. And so I feel people that get referred in are just set up for success because they have that deep contextual things that, someone who values their relationship more than just getting another person on board, will say, if I don't want to bring you on if I know you're going to hate me because I put you into a spot where you're just not going to enjoy the job. So I'm going to tell you, both the good and the bad and kind of also where we're headed, because probably where we're headed is what you're going to be most exposed to, and give you the context for some of the things that are happening. I think that's, I mean, I think that's probably the primary reason why referrals usually work out so well, is because our employer brand has been so broken and terrible for so long that you end up like looking for other sources of truth. And the people that have that best source of truth ultimately do better. It's sort of this like very self-fulfilling prophecy of that. I don't think it's not a light bulb moment or a genius observation. I just think like you got to think about like, how can you bring that like contextual, deep, rich experience to anybody? Like outside, you start talking about the D&I implications of that, but like that's one of the things that I've just noticed time and time again from that. I don't know if I want to go down the referral rabbit hole, but that's just one of the observations I've seen.
Well, it springs from the same source for me, which is, when you think about employer brand as a tactic for overcoming a specific, business issue that you're facing, like turnover, as opposed to, truly engaging an employee experience process, of which employer brand is one part, you have to recognize the role of referrals. People will refer a candidate when they're having a great employee experience. And, we know that, candidates who are referred, tend to be the highest quality across multiple dimensions. But you can't force someone with incentives or marketing programs or whatever to refer, quality candidates that they really care about if the employee experience itself is not worth advocating for. Yeah. And again, it's the same in CX. Word of mouth is a powerful mover. People believe their friends more than they believe commercials or, ad campaigns or, whatever. But that word of mouth, it's like every app that I use. I'm sure you're the same way. Every app that I use when I'm ordering food or groceries or anything, the experience always ends with the process of, hey, refer a friend and, get $25 or whatever. Well, if I was going to refer, someone to an app, it would be because I really loved it. And I probably wouldn't want, I would do it outside of the app itself. I'm not just going to blast all my contacts so that I can get an extra, $100 or something, on a food delivery app.
That's right.
But if I really, am having a great experience, it's almost social capital for me to go to someone and say, hey, have you tried this? Yeah. It's amazing. You should totally do it. And I'll do that when I, find something I truly like. But, we wouldn't, from a CX perspective, try to drive word of mouth when we know that the potential for negative content in that word of mouth, because word of mouth isn't always good. No. That if the potential content in that word of mouth is, if the sentiment leans heavily negative, then we need to get that under control before, we start, activating all these things. And so to me, it comes from the same source, which is, people tend to view referrals tactically. They tend to view employer branding tactically, et cetera, as opposed to thinking about it holistically from an employee experience perspective of, hey, we actually have to work on the product as well. Make sure that the gap between the marketing of our product and the product itself is not so large as to be, damaging. And so I want to go back to the, this kind of, 1-2 punch traditional way and what's wrong with it. Cause I keep saying, well, we have a framework and blah, 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 but we haven't really talked about it.
Yeah.
And so, like I said, most of the time it's, hey, let's do some research or scan the research that we've already done and let's create a message. And then, we'll figure out how to apply that message in a different context. All of those things are necessary, but they're not sufficient. And so we have a process called the Honeycomb, and everything that we do follows this process. We start with strategy, we go to research, we go to create, which is doing whatever, needs to be done. In this case, let's call it an employee value proposition. And then we'll validate it, which is an incredibly important, and most often missed phase. And then we'll activate it, which is, actually doing the stuff that needs to be done in order for whatever was created to hit the goals that were specified in the strategy. And then the final stage is measure it. And choosing what to measure and knowing what to measure is incredibly important because it can throw you in the wrong direction. So strategy, research, create, validate, activate, and measure. Those are the 6 phases we put everything through.
Yep.
And so we would start, before we ever went out and did a bunch of research, we'd start with strategy. We would understand or seek to understand why an organization feels that working on their employer brand at this particular moment is significant. I'm just talking about employer brand right now. I'm not talking about employee experience. I'm just employer brand.
Yeah.
And a critical part of that process is being challenged and being challenging. Because so often, if a stakeholder or the owner in that process says, we want to work on our employer brand because we need to hire more candidates to replace the ones who are leaving, most internal groups, most agencies would say, okay, get it. Thanks for giving us the strategy, and that's the direction that we're going to navigate in.
That's right.
And I think we would look at it, and I would argue that everyone should look at it as, an opportunity to really evaluate whether we have the right strategy and whether the strategy that we're selecting at that time that we're, investing in the creation or discovery of an employer brand is actually at the right level to ensure a durable employer brand and not one that has to change, every 6 months based on what's going on environment. Can you think of some examples where, the strategy that people were looking for when deciding to evaluate their employer brand was not the right strategy for the organization?
Yeah. I mean, I think the biggest side of thing is just incoming interest is sort of like, that's sort of fast forwarding to sort of the measurement phase. But I mean, I think measurement's part of sort of the goal setting of, the strategy phase. What do we want to accomplish here? We want more candidates. We want more good candidates. We want better talent. They want to up-level their talent. Usually that's like, the primary goal is just like better attraction. And there's no like back-end metric for quality. So like, it's like, did we keep? Well, okay, we attracted them. They came, they accepted our offer because our employer brand worked that way. But did they stay? Like, cause are we just filling our organization with bad fit, employees? That's probably the number one, I think the fatal flaw of most of this is there's no back end quality check on what the employer brand is doing. So like, you could say like they would argue, lots of folks I think would argue that's not the job of the employer brand. I'm like, that's job number one of the employer brand is to make sure you're attracting the right folks, not just, not having to try to figure that out during the, the recruitment marketing phase, the candidate experience phase, and certainly not by the time they accept a job and start getting into their work experience where they figure out, oh, this is a bad fit. So yeah, I mean, I think that's probably number one. I don't know if you've seen any others, but
I think that's a great, I just put that in a category, which is strategies that are myopically focused on one metric.
That's it.
Tend to be, and I'll give you an even more myopic example, which is really the same, but seems absurd in comparison, which is we need to get our Glassdoor score up. Right.
That's right.
I mean, we hear that all the time. It's like, oh, my Glassdoor, it's on our dashboard. It's presented at the board level. It is our employer brand. And we need to get our score up. It's a 3.2, and our goal is to get it to a 4.5. Strategy go. Most organizations, most people got it. Yep, on it. Let's do it. Yep. And then you're in the surrogation trap, right? Where like what you're trying to achieve had an artificial number associated with it. So we want a better employer brand. The metric is improve our Glassdoor score. And then all of the tactics become about the number, the Glassdoor score, instead of actually improving the employer brand. And that takes you down a very different rabbit hole. Which is, as we see all the time, Companies hiring organizations that flood Glassdoor with fake reviews. You can buy reviews on Glassdoor just like you can buy followers on Twitter or, like whatever. Right. And I don't think that anyone would argue that that's an effective way to build a good employer brand, but it can be a very effective way for getting your score up to a 4.8 on Glassdoor. But, that's a great example of just the strategy driving, kind of the wrong, execution and process for employer brand.
Yep. Yeah. And, you see it happen. It's, and I think I said this last time, your Glassdoor score isn't your employer brand. So it's even asking like the wrong question in the wrong answer. So you're right. It's a surrogation trap because, if that, even if that was the issue, it's still too myopically focused, but it's not even the right issue. Right. So I think, starting at the strategy level is really critical. And I think having, a partner or someone you're working with who can just say like, hey, this isn't right. This is too focused, or this is focused on the wrong thing, or to even bring insights to the initial strategy to say, here's what you need to work on. Have some assumptions or a thesis going into that of like, here are some things I need to change before you ever go out to the research. Because I think what we see a lot of times on the research phase, and I know we'll go to that next, is just you kind of go out and just explore kind of aimlessly rather than like going out to actually like prove or refute a thesis about where your employer brand is, where it needs to improve, how does it need to perform in market. You just kind of go out just listlessly. And then that often leads to like a poor analysis on the research. Yeah. May have jumped forward there, but.
No, I think so. Just to go back to the Glassdoor thing to draw another parallel.
Yeah.
If you do the right things, your Glassdoor score will go up.
Yeah.
But you can make your Glassdoor score go up without doing the right things.
Yes.
And the question is, which one, would you, really think is the most durable, and which one would you really want? And I think sometimes people get lost in the minutia.
For sure.
And so, I think important pushback on strategy, where the strategy has to be rooted in a real, desire to create a good employee experience. Yep. And so if you are not interested in creating a great employee experience, you might be interested in creating a very specific kind of employee experience. And that, specific kind of employee experience may be, hey, this is a place where people come to work. We have clear expectations, and then they go home. And if that's the kind of organization you want to be, no judgment, but it's really important that, your employer brand is lined up, behind, the experience that you're actually trying to create. And so that promise that you deliver in your employer brand has to map with, what you're actually trying to achieve. And I think that's the kind of, we bring a pretty strong bullshit detector to, the strategy phase, because if it's not in an organization's heart, or a collective, kind of vision, to achieve the goals of the employer brand, we have to suss that out, because we, know that will actually lead to a more negative outcome than what they're experiencing now.
Well, and we've done this on the CX side, because we've heard, them just sing the praises, and it hasn't, when our bullshit detector hasn't worked 100%, which it never does. But when we go into the research phase, we find out the truth at some point, and we're just like, well, that's not right. So now we're kind of, now we have to back things up a little bit and figure out, okay, well, if your product actually isn't very good, or it's not what you're saying it is, then it's either a correction in like how you're doing things, or a correction in perception that we need to fix.
That's right. And so just specific point on that, if you're failing in a certain area, and you aspire to do better in that area from an employee experience perspective, it's okay to create a message that communicates that aspiration to the marketplace.
Yeah.
It's all about how it's communicated, and we really strongly, moving forward to like the activation phase, we strongly believe in an inside out model, which is if you are working on your employer brand and you are going to be engaged in promoting that employer brand in the marketplace, it's really important that you start with your own people about, around communicating what that employer brand is and why you're doing it in the organization, and acknowledging that we fall short of, certain aspirations for employee experience right now, but those are areas that we're, truly working on. And here's the evidence. And then following that, you kind of cascade that message, out until you're, finally in, the talent pools and the candidate infographics that you're marketing to bring people in. But so often, the employer brand exercise is considered specifically and, independently a marketing exercise. And, the first time employees hear about it is when they see an ad, on the Super Bowl or something like that right, about how great their job is. But moving forward to research, that link between strategy and research proves to be incredibly significant when you actually enter the research phase. And what stands out as one of the most significant issues with how employer brand and employer branding is approached right now. You have to set a frame. And so if you don't do the strategic work, you don't know what you're trying to achieve, and you don't have assumptions about it, you don't have any hypotheses to test. And so your research becomes basically deductive. So let's look at all of the information and let's deduce, a position or an opinion from that, as opposed to starting with an assumption. And having that proven or disproven, it tends to really narrow in the research on the strategy that you're trying to achieve.
Yeah.
Furthermore, we believe that, you should always be using a combination of primary, secondary, quantitative, and qualitative, research. And the more, modalities of research that you can use to gather information, the more accurate your proving or disproving of hypotheses will be as you go through that process. And I think that, the engagement survey, the annual engagement survey as a proxy for research that drives the creation of an employer brand is not a good proxy.
No.
Because it's myopically focused on categories of current expectations and doesn't consider, many of the other factors that actually contribute to a unique and, good quality employee experience and employer brand.
Yeah. I mean, there's so many challenges with the annual engagement survey anyways. It's hard to not dive down that. But I think in this specific context, it just doesn't give you any helpful information whatsoever. I mean, like even from a pure, promoter and detractor perspective, I don't even know if it's super helpful, especially if you're only doing it on sort of the annual basis. What we'd want to see is like trend lines over time, even to make summation about promoters and detractors. And what we want to ask an employer brand survey, if we're allowed to do that, is much more specific about their expectations coming in, about their experience coming into the organization, getting onboarded, getting up to speed, and being able to slice and dice that by when they came into the organization, where they're coming from, to get sort of a more holistic view of what that looks like. And so I think if you're relying on those engagement surveys, you're already way behind the ball on your information gathering. And it's really, I mean, it's if that's sort of the only quantitative work you're looking at to make decisions about it, you should just throw it out.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe that's a hot take, but.
Well, no, I mean, I totally agree.
Yeah.
the reality is that, and we learned this, from our CX experience, research has to be framed, based on, the strategic objectives, the right strategic objectives. And then research becomes a very dangerous or very useful phase. And it's a dangerous phase if you don't, do it the right way, to use a technical phrase. If you don't do it the right way and you end up, myopically focused on, groups that are biased, or that, some other bias is introduced that sends off false signals about, employer brand. So if we go back and recall that, employee experience is really just the perception of the quality of time that, people spend with an organization, or how they perceive that the quality of their time would be spent with an organization. When you get into the research phase of working on the employer brand, which is the front door to the employee experience, you really have to understand what those perceptions are right now. And understand where those perceptions need to go. And so, the research, component, oscillates between being very open-ended and broad in nature, so that you're not, superimposing an artificially rigid framework on the research that you're doing. You actually do research to figure out what research you should be doing. And that tends to be very open-ended. And tends to, lean more heavily on qualitative feedback, like interviews and stuff like that. And the more different audiences that you can, reach out to, the more accurate that 360 view looks. And then, based on the qualitative information that you get, that starts to give you structure for the questions to ask in a quantitative format. And so then you get the trend lines that you're talking about on issues that may have nothing to do with, the engagement, survey, structure or whatever. And then generally you tend to go back to a qualitative phase after that, so that you can tease out some details around the trends that you find. And again, multiple audiences. So if you're not, being very diligent about the strategic setup of the work, and the way the research is structured, to not just find answers to your questions, but to figure out what questions to ask and then find answers to those, you're pretty much screwed in everything after that. Because from employer brand, you go into recruitment marketing, you go into the candidate experience, you go into the work experience, you go into employee success. And if you are trying to promote a vision of the employee experience that was really created during this employer brand phase, but was inaccurately based on the wrong type of research, no research at all, poor strategy, no strategy, et cetera, then you're basically working really hard to fuck everything up down the road.
Well, it's the boat that, takes off from the dock and is a couple degrees off its heading, and it just keeps going, and you can miss a continent. You get waylaid, and the course corrections become more and more difficult as you go down the path of doing that. So, like, by the time you get to employee success, it's like you're so off track. And that's why you get that sort of like that short term, 365-day turnover mark that's huge, and people are like, well, what's happening? And HR and talent acquisition are pointing at each other like that Spider-Man meme. Like it was you. I was like, well, it was both of you. It's because that this is an expansive experience of everything from like before they even know about a job to when they're embedded into the organization and everything in between. And so, really employer brand and the research that you're doing ahead of that can really set you on, even if you're a little bit off, can be completely disastrous if you're not thoughtful about your approach.
Well, we did it again. We spent a lot more time talking about, like two parts of, employer brand. I want to continue the conversation on employer brand next week. And eventually we'll get to recruitment marketing, and eventually we'll get to candidate experience, and eventually we'll get to work experience, and eventually we'll get to employee success. But it seems like, the mistakes, the mistakes that we see most often in employer brand, are the ones that are most, resonant with, marketing, and the mistakes that, have been made in marketing over the decades that are well documented, much more so than, kind of employer branding. And so it's just a real, fertile area, for exploration, understanding that a lot of the work that you do to create your employer brand, is actually the real work of creating the employee experience that you want. I mean, that is the foundational, step. Yeah, and I think a lot of times people are just like, okay, we need to get our employee value proposition. Let's do it in the next 2 weeks so that we can go do all this other stuff. And if there was one area to spend the most time in, it would definitely be employer brand, because it ends up becoming a change management strategy for your actual employee experience if you're doing it the right way.
Yeah. I mean, so much of this work, I think a lot of people sort of recoil at the effort and the amount of time that you need to do this sort of research. But to your point, I think it not only informs employer brand, but it informs so many things in the employee experience that, you do a good, let's say, survey and research design along these lines, and you're able to check a lot of boxes across the whole employee experience. That's real critical work. And when you break it up into sort of its siloed components, not only do you sort of miss the bigger picture, but you're spending more, I think, more time, more money, more, more resources on this exercise that's not actually connecting the dots. Yeah. So we're obviously big fans of research, but I just want to point that out too.
Well, I mean, we see it in marketing all the time. Yeah. It's actually worse in HR. It's easier to get, $1 million budget for, paid media to place ads than it is to get a budget for doing the work that's necessary to make sure that the message that goes into those ads is effective and authentic. So, I know from a client perspective, when clients get frustrated, it's most likely that they're going to get frustrated in the brand phase, because it feels like there's a lot of time, being used up without a lot of output. It doesn't look like there's a lot of stuff, coming out of it. Yeah, and I get it.
Me too.
Because, basically you're doing all of this work to get down to, basically 2 or 3 sentences, on the message side, and maybe a 30, slide PowerPoint presentation on what your employer brand is and how it should be implemented. And so if you, ask for 6 months to do that the right way, and the output's going to be a 30 slide presentation, where one slide has, kind of the thing that you paid for. Yeah, that's, can be frustrating for people who don't understand the significance or haven't learned the significance of getting that part right before you move into, a lot of the other aspects that people are just willing to throw money at, in many cases inefficiently. But anyway, we go on and on and on. I could. Let's pick it up next week.
Sounds great. We'll talk to you then.
Bye.